just before dawn on August 15th, 1984, in the West Province of Cameroon. 72-year-old Abdu was riding on his bike to a neighbouring village when he came to a dip in the road. Riding down it, he would see a pickup truck sitting in the middle of the road. Next to the truck, he would find the corpse of a local priest, and further up the road would see the body of a man slumped over his stalled motorcycle. At first, Abdu believed an accident may have taken place, but neither the truck or the motorcycle were damaged, and both men showed no sign of injury. Suddenly, Abdu felt as if some sort of trance had come over him, sapping him of his energy. Continuing on foot, he would pass a herd of dead sheep, and then more vehicles, with more dead inside. Walking up the hill, Abdu spotted a friend of his heading down the road he had just come from. Abdu wanted to warn him of what was down there, but still under this strange trance had lost the ability to speak. The two men approached each other, and Abdu, without a word, just shook his friend's hand and continued walking to the nearby village, while his friend headed in the direction of the corpses. Abdu would survive, but his friend and the 36 others would not be so lucky. When word began to spread about the road where 37 people and a herd of sheep had just died without any noticeable cause, rumours began to circulate. Some believed it to be chemical warfare, others a coup or a political conspiracy. Looking into the local geology, officials would theorise that the long-dormant volcano under the Lake Monoun had reactivated. This theory would see the US Embassy employ Haraldur Sigurdsson, a volcanologist, to travel to Cameroon and investigate what had happened. After many tests, he would find that there was no sign of volcanic eruptions, but when they attempted to collect a water sample using a bottle, something concerning would happen. The lid of the bottle would pop off. This would reveal that the water in Lake Monoun was full of carbon dioxide deposits and explain the deaths on the stretch of the road Abdu had come across. If the air contains 5% carbon dioxide, it snuffs out car engines. At 10%, it causes people to hyperventilate, grow dizzy, and eventually fall into a coma. If the air is 30% carbon dioxide, people will gasp and die from carbon dioxide asphyxiation. Haraldur would conclude that the carbon dioxide was coming from the magma of the volcano beneath Lake Monoun. This meant that concentrated carbon dioxide was dissolving in the lake and building up for potential centuries. Haraldur would realise just how dangerous this could be and submit an article to a prestigious US science journal claiming this phenomenon had the potential to wipe out entire towns, but his claims would be rejected as far-fetched. Only a few months after this journal was rejected, a man by the name of Ephraim, who lived in the northwest of Cameroon by Lake Nyos, would hear what sounded like a landslide. Looking out from his mud brick house, he would see a white mist rising from the lake, and without much thought would mention to his 4 children that it looked like it may rain the next day, before going to sleep, feeling slightly ill. Halima Saleh, who lived off the shore of the river, would hear the same sound, but describe it as sounding like many people shouting. Halima would then feel a gust of wind pass through her family's huts, before immediately passing out. When Ephraim woke the next morning and made his way down to the lake, he saw its colour had changed from its usual blue to a dull red. When he got closer, he began to notice the still silence in the air. The usual sounds of the village and even the birds and the insects he was used to were completely absent. A wave of fear washed over him, and his knees began to shake as he moved along the river. Suddenly, a scream would break the silence, and he would see Halima, who in a frenzy of grief had torn off her clothes and was surrounded by the bodies of her children, 31 family members, and 400 cattle. Halima would scream Ephraim's name and ask, "Why are these people lying here? Why won't they move again?" Ephraim watched as Halima dropped to the ground and desperately tried to shake her lifeless father's body awake. Ephraim would run towards the village on the lower Nyos to check on his family who lived there. When he arrived, he would see the village littered with bodies, totaling close to 1,800 people and over 3,000 cattle. Ephraim's parents, siblings, uncles and aunts had all passed seemingly in the same spots they would have been at 9 PM the night before. Some lay near the cooking fires, in doorways and in their beds, but all were lifeless. The wave of death was so unforgiving that even the flies, which usually swarmed corpses, had also been killed. Over the next day, some people would wake up only to find groups of their family members dead next to them, causing many to commit suicide soon after. The article Haraldur had proposed, which had been deemed far-fetched by his peers, had become a reality mere months after he'd written it. The Cameroon military would begin to bury the victims of the event in a mass grave, and within days scientists from around the world would come to Cameroon to help the situation. When they arrived, so too did heavy rain, and the people of the village remaining, who had lost everything including the cattle they relied on for food, took the researchers into their home and fed them. One researcher would state, "Can you imagine that? These people had just lost everything, and they worried about us." While the military had driven out most of who lived in the area, Ephraim was allowed to stay as he was living on high ground. Luckily, being allowed to stay meant he was offered a well-paying job helping the researchers. This was vital for Ephraim because he now had 11 children after adopting the 7 children his uncle had left behind in passing. Halima and her husband, who was not in the village at the time of the disaster, would move to a new compound where they would have 5 more children and raise 40 cattle. When speaking about the event, she would say, "I'm no more thinking about the disaster. I have more children. I'm thinking about the children I have now. The only problem is the lack of cattle to feed them and to pay for them to go to school." Halima's husband would add, "If I think about what I was, what the family was, I can go crazy, so I try not to. We are believers. Your children can survive you, or you can survive your children. It's all in the hands of God." As for the Lake Nyos, researchers would eventually implement a plan to put a pipeline through it which would degas the carbon dioxide in the water. While they have implemented one of these pipelines, they do believe that they need many more to degas it within a reasonable amount of time. Born on the 1st of June 1874, Ludger Silberus was a labourer in St. Pierre, a town on the island of Martinique. On the night of May 7th, 1902, Ludger would be involved in a fight that would see him arrested. Though there are differing accounts as to the reason why he was actually arrested, we do know for certain that Ludger would be ordered into solitary confinement and locked in a single cell that was built partially underground and bomb-proof. He still had no windows and only received ventilation from the narrow grating on the door he was locked behind. We can't know for certain what Ludger was thinking, but it wouldn't be a stretch to say he wished he was anywhere but in that cell. Little did he know this cell would be the thing that saved him from one of the deadliest volcano eruptions in recorded history. The eruption was that of Mount Pelée, which when done, would claim the lives of over 30,000 people. We tend to think of it as one big explosion pouring out sulfur and gas into the air while hot lava floods out incinerating everything in its path. But the eruption of Mount Pelée showed many signs of what was to come. It was on the 23rd of April 1902 when Mount Pelée would first wake from its slumber, shaking the ground and raining rocks down on villages on the southern and western slopes of the mountain. This first event was dismissed, and even 2 days after, when the mountain shook the ground of St. Pierre, spewing ash and rock from its peak, it did not cause any anxiety. Those involved would see the ash blanketing the city and the smell of sulfur as a mere inconvenience. Wife to the American consul in St. Pierre would describe the event in a letter to her sister, stating, "We can see Mount Pelée from the rear windows of our house, and although it is nearly 4 miles away, we can hear the roar. The city is covered with ashes. The smell of sulfur is so strong that horses on the street stop and snort, and some of them drop in their harness and die from suffocation. Many of the people are obliged to wear handkerchiefs to protect them from the strong fumes of sulfur. My husband assures me that there is no immediate danger, and when there is the least particle of danger, we will leave the place." At 11:30 p.m. on May the 2nd, the sound of explosions would break the quiet of the night as the earth tremored and dark pillars of smoke laced with volcanic lightning would rise out of the mountain. St. Pierre's citizens rushed out of their homes, half-dressed and watching the display in awe, while many others, fearing an earthquake, spent the rest of their night sleeping in open courtyards. However, the feeling was much more urgent for the villagers living closer to the mountain, with many fleeing their homes and land with little belongings in fear of what was to come. By the 4th of May, the sea was littered with birds who had suffocated, and ash fell so densely, sailors avoided the coast, fearing if caught in the ash, they wouldn't be able to navigate. With the ash so heavy, and many food and water sources contaminated, many realized this was much more serious than they had first thought. At this point, many were aware something was very wrong, and those who could flee did exactly that, but sadly in times like this, not everyone has that opportunity. In a letter sent to a French relative, a woman living in St. Pierre would say, "My calmness astonishes me. I am waiting the event tranquilly. My only suffering is from the dust, which penetrates everywhere, even through closed doors and windows. We are calm. Mama is not a bit anxious. Edith alone is frightened. If death awaits us, there will be a numerous company to leave the world. Will it be fire or asphyxia? It will be what God wills. You will have our last thoughts. Tell Brother Robert that we are still alive. This will, perhaps, be no longer true when this letter reaches you. At 1 p.m. on the 5th of May, the citizens of St. Pierre would watch the sea's tide recede 330 feet before smashing back into the city and flooding parts of it. As more smoke began to pour out of Mount Pelée, a mixture of boiling water, mud, and other debris would fill a nearby river, flooding the local sugar works and burying 150 people under 300 feet of mud. With the impending fear of doom looming over the island, refugees from these affected areas escaped into the ash-covered city of St. Pierre. While the refugees and citizens spread their stories of the boiling mud and water landslides, animal deaths, and flooding, the electrical grid would fail and the city would fall into darkness. At 2 a.m. the people of St. Pierre would be awoken to the grumbling of Mount Pelée, and only 24 hours later, volcanic lightning would paint the dark city a reddish-orange. As people in the city continued to flee, those from the countryside would enter, and the newspapers would continue to circulate with headlines claiming the city was safe. Strangely, reassurance would come in the form of another volcanic eruption on the nearby St. Vincent Island, with the belief and hope that this eruption alleviated pressure on Mount Pelée. It would appear to those still in the area that this was the case, as the mountain's tremors would calm. On the morning of May 8th, a night shift telegraph operator would send his report to the capital Fort-de-France stating there was no new developments. Moments later, the operator in Fort-de-France would attempt to reply, only to find the line was now dead. Without warning, the upper mountainside would rip open, and from within, a dense black cloud would shoot out horizontally. A second cloud would burst from atop the mountain, forming a mushroom cloud and turning the bright morning sky dark in a 50-mile radius. As both clouds moved at over 100 miles per hour, superheated steam, volcanic gases, and dust with temperatures exceeding over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit rushed toward the city. In under a minute, it swept the city, instantly igniting anything combustible and burning those caught in it alive. Those lucky enough to be watching on the boats offshore would say it was as if the town vanished before their eyes. A local French shoemaker, who happened to survive the ordeal, would say, "I felt a terrible wind blowing, the earth began to tremble, and the sky suddenly became dark. I turned to go into my house. With great difficulty, climbed the 3 or 4 steps that separated me from my room, and felt my arms and legs burning, also my body. I dropped upon a table. At this moment, 4 others sought refuge in my room, crying and writhing in pain, although their garments showed no sign of having been touched by flame. At the end of 10 minutes, one of these young girls, aged about 10 years, fell dead. The others left. I got up and went to another room, where I found the father, still clothed and lying on the bed, dead. He was purple and inflated, but the clothing was intact. Crazed and almost overcome, I threw myself on a bed, inert and waiting death. My senses returned to me in perhaps an hour, when I beheld the roof burning. With sufficient strength left, my legs bleeding and covered with burns, I ran to Font Saint-Denis, 6 kilometers from St. Pierre. Ludger was waiting for his breakfast to be brought to him in his cell when suddenly everything became dark and hot air mixed with ash seeped through the grating on his cell door, burning him. In seconds he could smell his own flesh burning, though his clothes did not catch fire. Ludger screamed for help, but no one came, as they were probably already dead. Doing his best to breathe in as little air as possible, he endured the flash of heat as it burned the skin off his back, legs, arms, and hands. 3 days later he would be found by salvage workers, who were able to dig him out. Once out, he would recover from his wounds, be pardoned for his crimes, and later join the Barnum and Bailey's circus, touring America and retelling the horrors of the Mount Pelée eruption. During the year of 1871, the residents of Peshtigo, Wisconsin, much like the rest of the United States at the time, had been suffering from a drought, and with it came fires. For weeks leading up to October, the residents of Peshtigo had lived with the threat of fire and the smoke it brings as it engulfs the surrounding lands. However, the smoke on the 8th of October was worse than anything they had encountered before. Soon residents would notice ash fall like snowflakes down on their small town, and after many began to head home from church, they would hear the roar of something coming from the southwest. A sound residents would compare to that of threshing machinery or freight trains. But as the wind grew stronger, they would soon realize it was something much worse. As the winds picked up, a blinding light would peak overhead and signal their worst fears had arrived. At the time, the town was the largest producer of wood products in the country. Almost every house timber framed, and the roads themselves had been lined with sawdust. Now, it was faced with a fire so large and intense that it couldn't be fought, though some men would try. Soon those sleeping would be awoken to the crashing of trees and crackling of fire as it tore through their roofs and swept across the town in every direction, quickly cornering the residents. As the reality of the situation became apparent, both people and cattle filled the streets. Some tried hiding, but there was nowhere in town the flames couldn't reach. Others rushed to the bridge over the stream, but were confronted with groups from the other side who were attempting to flee in their direction. Confused and unsure as to what direction was safe to flee in, they would ultimately find themselves stuck on the bridge until it too caught fire and eventually collapsed, killing many of those trapped on it. Hundreds fled to the river as the flames enclosed them from every direction. Searing heat and hungry flames tore apart everything they had, and for many, those they loved. Though the river was not a guarantee, some clung to debris to stay afloat, only to be knocked off by the animals that shared the water with them and drown. Others would be unable to stay afloat from the sheer exhaustion of spending hours in the water as the fire burned around them. Those who were unlucky enough to seek refuge in a smaller body of water even boiled to death, a fact Grace Newberry and her family weren't aware of as they fled to a pond and huddled together as the very air around them appeared to burn. After spending some time in the pond, Grace's husband would attempt to leave it and flee the area, taking her 2 children with him, but his attempt would result in all 3 dying. Grace and her remaining family members would wait out the fire in the pond, and by the end of it, 89 bodies would litter the area around them. When the fire passed, it would leave over 2,000 people dead in its wake, and Grace would suffer from temporary blindness from its effects. After this event, Grace would move to Vermont, remarry, and have 2 more children. And that's all the stories we have for today. Thank you for listening. If you did like, make sure to like and subscribe if you want to. I know it's not the Reddit stuff that you probably subscribed for, but it's just a lot more interesting doing these sort of stories for me. So, sorry. Have a good night. Until next time.